Hello and happy Friday. Happy Findmypast Friday, to be exact. It's me again, Alex Cox, back twice in 2 weeks. What a treat for me, that is, not for you. Well, hopefully it will be. Hello to everybody who's tuning in. I can see we've already got about 50-odd people watching, which is a great start. Hello, Diane. Hello, Kelly. Let it climb a little bit higher before we dive in. Hello, William. Lovely to hear from you. Hello, Paul. Lovely to hear from you too. Karen, Nicole, Sue, hello everybody. Yeah, brilliant. We'll jump in now. Good amount of people watching. Well, I hope you're well. I hope you're enjoying this. Well, I'll say slight spring weather. It's been a bit rubbish in the UK at the moment, but these longer evenings are greatly appreciated. What are we talking about today? Anyway, that's what I should start with, really, isn't it? Well, today is Friday, so of course we've got new records, including a very interesting new collection which sheds light on a often kind of forgotten piece of history from the First World War, I think. So I'll be looking forward to telling you a little bit more about that, as well as all the other lovely new records we've got this weekend for you to explore over the weekend. And of course, everyone in the UK will probably be aware that the 2021 census of England, Wales and Northern Ireland is rapidly approaching. 21st of March, I believe, is Census Day. The campaign to encourage us all to fill in our forms is ramping up. Every time you switch on the television, you'll be seeing census adverts. I had my census form in the post the other day, and I thought, with that in mind, can't really do today's broadcast and not talk about census records. In many ways, they're the bread and butter of family history research. You know, most of us would have found it incredibly difficult to get started without them. I know I certainly would. But also, they're an amazing way of looking back at demographic patterns over time. And I like to think of them very much as snapshots of moments in time, you know, characterized, for example, by suffragettes sabotaging the 1911 census. That provides a great little window into what was going on in society at that time. So yeah, today we'll be taking a look at all things census related, as well as our new records, including some fascinating research that's been done by our colleagues over at the British Newspaper Archive, which has been using historical newspapers basically to look at how the public reacted to censuses over time, going all the way back to the first census in 1801 up to the 20th century. So looking forward to sharing that with you. And depending on how we get on for time, because as usual, I've bitten off far more than I can probably chew in an hour, I'd also like to look at some interesting examples of female impersonators from our newspaper archive. But that is to be confirmed. We'll see how we get on for time. If we've got time, we'll look at it. Great. If not, doesn't matter. So, as always, we'll start off with question of the week. Today is very much census themed, so question of the week is in that vein as well. Tell us all about your best census finds. As I've already touched on, censuses are essential, so I'm sure most of you have found something very significant in your own family history journey. But have you found anything remarkable? Have you found anything surprising, shocking? All of the above. Tell us. Sorry, I'm just getting messages, which I will close because they are distracting me. So yeah, that is this week's question of the week. Pop them in the comments. I will try my best to read some of them out, and just so I can spot them more easily, it'd be great if you could start them with that little initial there, QOTW, and then I'll know that you're responding to the question. And as always, if you have any questions about anything whatsoever, whether it's about what we're talking about today, whether it's the new records we've just released, pop them in the comments and I will try and ask. If you're tuning in for the first time, we've got a wonderful community of very enthusiastic helpers. Oh, I can see Audrey's watching. Hello, Audrey. Oh dear, that makes me nervous. If there's a census expert, it is Audrey Collins. I hope I don't say anything incorrect, because I'm sure Audrey will correct me. But brilliant to know you're here, Audrey. If anybody has more expert census questions, pop them in the comments. Maybe Audrey will have not have a stab. She'll know the answer. So let's have a look at some of the comments before we take a look at some records. So lots of people saying hello. Hello, Julie. Hello, Rosie. Hello, Beth. Sorry, not Biff. Beth. Beth's just had her census form through the post today. Her parents got theirs last week. Hilary Godsby's had hers as well. Chris Calvert, I look forward to the release of the 1921 census next year. So do we. So do we. Work is still very much underway. We're incredibly excited. Can't wait to bring that online. And I'm particularly excited to see what kind of amazing insights that will give into the population of England and Wales at what is a really significant and important period of British history. You know, you're just following the First World War, following the suffrage movement. You'll have all those families that were impacted by the events of the war. You'll have the women that were in the workplace in increasing numbers for the first time. It's going to be amazing. Not that long to go, so let's have another quick look. Already getting some answers through to question of the week. So Marion Allen said, question of the week, I found my husband's grandfather on 2 census returns for 1911. Yeah, I agree with Emoji. That is perplexing. Maybe Audrey can shed a little bit more light on that. Beth Whitty said, question of the week, I found that my great-great-grandparents had a 3rd child that we didn't know about, and that was thanks to censuses. Shows the amazing power of census records, yet again. And hello to Anne in sunny Florida, very jealous. I'm in very rainy Twickenham right now. Sylvia Valentine, question of the week. Hi everybody, question of the week. My late mother-in-law is on the 1911 census. I remember showing it to my husband. Lovely. And a fantastic tip from Miko, who's a font of knowledge when it comes to all things genealogy related, said, read every part of the census. It's a snapshot of time, and different years will give you a lot of extra information. They can really push you further. Thank you for that, Miko. Very true. And Denise from McKnight said, question of the week, working on the transcript only, I thought my great-great-aunt had the wonderful name Selina. That is a lovely name, isn't it? Looking at the actual form, it was actually Lillian, and my grandmother was named after her. So that is a fantastic example of why you should always look at the images, not only the transcripts. So before we dive into this week's new records, I just wanted to share a little bit of news. An update we have made recently based off your own recommendations, and it actually relates to our new and improved image viewer. And I wanted to highlight this because it's perfect. It's a great example of how we do listen. We are eager to hear your feedback. We care and we act on it. So thank you to everybody who's been submitting feedback on the forum. If you're not a member of the forum already, get involved, join the conversation. But basically, we had quite a few people getting in touch saying they'd like the ability to hide the navigation tool on our new image viewer. I'm pleased to announce that change has now been made. You are able to do this. All you need to do is click the close all pages button at the bottom right-hand corner of the image viewer. And then to open them again, click all pages. Simple, very, very easy. Quick note though, at present, the page may not remember your choice to hide it. And this is something that our search team are looking at implementing in the not too distant future. So yeah, thank you very much for the feedback. You are helping us make Findmypast better. And please continue doing so. So let's have a quick look and see if any burning questions have come through before we take a look at this week's new records. Sylvia is saying one of her favourite things about census, the length of marriage and number of children is one of my favourite aspects. Helped remember the children who sadly died young. Yeah, that is very true. And length of marriage can also be incredibly useful if you're trying to track down a marriage record. And one more, let's read one more. Kelly McDonald, finding my great-grandma on the 1911 census made me giggle. When she married in November 1910, she said she was 21, but in the 1911 census, she gave her correct age of 17, with a 9-week-old baby. She was about 6 months pregnant when she married. Scandalous indeed. That's a great find. And actually, that's another thing to remember as well. One of the things about census forms, census returns, is they're often only as reliable as the people that filled them in. So don't always take what you're seeing as fact. Don't take it as gospel. I've actually had the opposite to Kelly. Rather than an ancestor getting older in the censuses, quite a few of my female ancestors got mysteriously younger as the censuses progressed, shaving off a couple of years here and there. Which is just another little lovely insight into ancestors' personality and family dynamics, I guess. But anyway, we're already 10 minutes in and haven't even started talking about this week's new records yet. So what have we got? Well, as I've said, it's Friday. We publish new records or add new records to our existing collections every single week, and this week is no different. Along with newspapers, we've got a rather eclectic mix, I'd say. We've got new records from London, Yorkshire, and India. But the ones I'm particularly excited about are our new collection of London Fire Brigade reports, 1915 to 1918. I love these. They're transcript only. There's about 5,000 records in the collection, but they're fascinating and quite thought-provoking, actually. So these were transcripts of original reports that were made by the London Fire Brigade covering air raids on London between 1915 and 1918. This was what I was saying at the start. I think it's kind of an often forgotten piece of World War One history. Most people associate civilian strategic bombing raids with the Second World War, and weren't aware that actually the Germans were pretty enthusiastic about it during the First. They launched a number of strategic bombing campaigns, the most significant of which was easily the one that was conducted against Britain. But they were carried out or attempted on some other fronts. And the main campaign against Britain actually started in January 1915, which is why our collection spans from 1915 to 1918. And these were using airships. So from 1915, basically up until the end of the First World War, the German Navy and the Army Luftstreitkräfte, apologies, I'm not great at pronunciations, mounted actually over 50 bombing raids on the UK. They were generally referred to by the public at the time as Zeppelin raids, although Zeppelins weren't the only kind of craft used. There was also something called the Schutzland airship, but Zeppelin was easily the most well-known company at the time. They were responsible for producing the vast majority of the airships the German military used, and that's why they just generally became to be known as Zeppelin raids. So they weren't particularly trustworthy, I guess, if you could use that word, or effective, maybe. There are a whole multitude of things that could completely throw things off course. Weather conditions, night flying conditions, basically meant that airship navigation was incredibly difficult, and therefore conducting bombing raids with any degree of accuracy was, by extension, also incredibly difficult. So bombs were often dropped significantly far off target. I mean, I think my favorite example of this, which just shows how wild the accuracy around this could be, was one raid that was actually targeted at London, ended up bombing Hull, completely opposite end of the country. So that gives you an idea of how difficult it was for them to hit specific targets. So targeting military installations was practically impossible. And that meant that most of the bombs found their way to civilian targets. And these civilian casualties made Zeppelins an object of intense hatred amongst the British public. If you look in our newspapers, there's all kinds of damning reports about these air raids. They were actually dubbed baby killers quite frequently by the press because they were so indiscriminate. And they caused quite a lot of psychological damage as well. And they caused so much turmoil at home that the British military authorities actually put quite a lot of resources into developing effective defensive measures against these raids. So they became increasingly hazardous for the aircrew, and by 1917, the Germans had largely replaced these Zeppelins with airplanes. And as I've already said, while they may not have been able to target military targets and can significantly disrupt the war effort in that way, they did have an incredibly powerful psychological effect on the population. They caused widespread alarm. A fact that blew my mind when I was learning about this actually was that between May 1917 and May 1918, more than 300,000 people, this is World War I, 1917 to 1918, more than 300,000 people used the London Underground to shelter from German raids. Well, this is actually the aeroplane raids after 1917. But the thing that blew my mind about this was that that's actually double the amount of people that were regularly sheltering in the Tube at the height of the London Blitz in 1940. So never think that, never fall into the mistake of thinking that civilian raids during World War I were minor. They weren't. They were a big deal at the time. So they kind of helped the Germans in that way. They caused a lot of psychological terror, and this forced the military authorities to divert quite a lot of resources away from the Western Front, and actually disrupt some resources away from general industrial production towards protecting civilian populations and making people feel a bit safer. And the responsibility for these defences were divided pretty evenly, actually, between the Admiralty and the Army. But there was loads of concerns. You can read about this in some of the newspapers. Concerns around the conduct of the defence against these raids led to parliamentary inquiries under the famous Jan Smuts, who created a famous report which actually led to the creation of the Royal Air Force on the 1st of April 1918. So yeah, this was all stuff I learned yesterday. So I hope you're finding it as interesting as I did. And yeah, just kind of wrapping up, I guess, the defence organisations developed by the British was a very important precursor. It laid the foundations to the flight direction system that would prove basically vital, which almost won. Not you can't not include the pilots, but it was one of the key things that won the Battle of Britain. So history is fascinating, isn't it? I guess another reason they were quite influential was because they led to an overestimation of both the material and psychological effects of the bombing of cities. I think I talked about this when we did our Blitz broadcast back in last year, I think, that the government believed that significant amounts of people would be hospitalized in mental institutions, nervous breakdowns, people would go down into the shelters and refuse to come out, but the opposite was true. It rallied everybody together and united people for a common cause. And sorry, I will stop talking about this shortly, but another cool little offshoot of history was of these air raids was one of the other things they gave the world was the development of pajamas for women. This is a very minor consequence, but it actually happened. The risk of being driven out of bed at night led to the development of pajamas for women. You wouldn't want to be running down in your night I don't know what you'd call them back then. Your sensitive garment? No, that's a terrible description. Your nightshirt? I don't know. But yeah, they also led to the creation of pajamas for women. Yeah, so I'm making light of it, but they were tragic. They killed about 557 and injured about over 1,300 people. About 5,000 bombs were dropped across Britain, causing I think about 1.5 million pounds in damage in money back then. So yeah, really, really interesting history. And if you want to know more about that, one of the best things you could probably do would be to have a look in these fascinating new records. So what will they tell you? Well, the transcripts will tell you the name, first and last name of the residents of the place that was hit. If it was a business, it'll tell you what kind of business it was, the proprietor or the occupier. It'll tell you the date this happened, house number, address, borough, postcode, insurance details. So they're quite detailed, actually. Sometimes the name and address of the landlord, the raid number, bomb number, whether it was a supposed cause of fire, and the time at which the fire brigade was called. But the most interesting bit probably is the details of the damage they list. So you'll find examples of bombs missing their targets with notes like some shrubs damaged by fire in a yard at the rear of the premises, or sadly more devastating ones like H.T. Good, aged 49, and Carolina Good, aged 47, burned to death. So yeah, reminding there is some kind of somber history behind these. So yeah, that's one of the interesting collections we've got up this week. But that is not all. We have also added we've added quite a lot of new records. I think, well, yeah, quite a lot. Over 27,000 new records to our collection of Yorkshire Monumental Inscriptions. This is a big collection, spans 9 centuries. Yes, you heard that right, 9 whole centuries of Yorkshire history. I believe some of them date back to the late 12 or early 1300s. And I talk about them a lot, so I probably don't need to go into masses of detail about why memorial inscriptions are amazing. Just take my word for it, they are. You can find out way more than you bargained for. You may find the names of additional family members. You may find biographical information, as well as those important dates and locations to add to your growing family tree. And then last but by no means least, we've added what we call a rolling release to our collection of British India Office births and baptisms. So these are records that we're able to publish due to privacy rules. So these span from 1921, 100 years ago, up to 1937. And I wanted to flag these because I just wanted to remind everybody that we do have this incredible collection of British India Office records. We published them in partnership with the British Library many, many, many moons ago. I think it was back in like 2000 or 2013 or something. They're a collection we sometimes forget to talk about. So I'm hoping people don't forget they're on the site, because if you have ancestors who traveled or settled in India in search of fame or fortune and have family there, or maybe they were there for multiple generations. These records are probably one of the best resources you're going to be able to find online. They cover 200 years of incredibly rich history, covering both eras of British rule in India, when the East India Company was in control from 1757 up to 1858, up to the British Raj, which is when the British government and the Crown stepped in to take control after the devastating impact of the Indian Sepoy uprising, when the Indian Sepoy, when the British were very nearly kicked out of India. So yeah, they cover the Raj as well, from 1858 to 1947, and there's a lot in there. You've got births, marriages, and deaths. One of the things I love about our India office, deaths and burials, is that they actually record cause of death. You'll see all kinds of exotic ailments in there, from diphtheria to cobra bites to tiger maulings to elephant gorings. Not all of them are that interesting, of course, but they're truly fascinating records. There's also about 200,000 wills and probate records of European soldiers and civilians and civil servants who died in India and Burma. They can be incredibly detailed as well. Images are available with the vast majority of these as well, which you should always look at, because they'll give you loads of detail. We've got collections on assistant surgeons. We've got India Office, Army and Navy pensions, East India Company and civil service pensions. It really is a mixed bag. If you want to explore those, I'm sure you can go to our A to Z of record search, type in India and see what comes back. You'll see all the individual collections. Yeah, fantastic resource, one not to be missed if you're interested in that kind of period of Indian history, or if you suspect your family may have put roots down over there. So yeah. And then, of course, we have, as we do every single week, we've added a load of new newspapers. I'm not going to bore you by reading every single one out, because I don't think that'll do anybody any good. But Ellie can pop a link to the blog in the comments, which she's already done. I can see Ellie has already done that. Thank you very much, Ellie. So yeah, the blog is probably one of the best places you can visit to keep completely up to date with everything we add on a weekly basis. You can follow the links to each individual collection page. So yeah, keep checking that regularly if you don't, especially if you don't receive our Findmypast Friday emails. So before we start talking about the wonderful world of Census Records, I'm going to have another quick look at some comments, which are coming through faster than I can actually keep up with. It's great to see everybody being so active today. Friday, maybe it's that Friday feeling. Nicole Hassel, in response to question of the week, has said, when searching for my great-great-grandfather's past, I found him living with his grandmother in Birmingham and his step-grandfather and his aunt when he was about 7. What I found a little bit funny was that his name was Clarence, and whoever took the census at the time marked him down as a girl and not a boy. Made me laugh a little bit after finally finding him on the census records. Thanks for sharing that, Nicole. And it goes back to my earlier point of they're only as reliable as the folks that filled them in. So do bear that in mind. Janet Sutton's pleased to hear about, oh wow, Janet's pleased to hear about the new London Fire Brigade reports, because she has an ancestor that was actually a victim of one of those terrifying Zeppelin raids. Oh wow, well, I hope you find them in there, Janet, and if you do, get in touch and let us know. And you know how to do that, folks. That is by sending an email through to discoveries@findmypast.com. If any of you have a story to share, I'm just thinking off the top of my head now, if anybody has an amazing census story that they'd be happy to share with the world, or more specifically, happy for us to share with the world, whether that's on our blog, whether that's on social media, or perhaps even in the newspapers, do get in touch. Send your story through to discoveries@findmypast. We check the inbox every day. We have great fun reading them, and we're very appreciative of everything that comes through. Let's have a look at a few more comments. Linda Kirk, fab, my granddad joined the LFB, but not unfortunately till 1919. Oh wow, served through the Blitz. I bet he had some stories to tell, and worked as a divisional officer, retired in 1955. I wonder, Linda, if you found him in the 1939 register, did you see any indication next to his name that he was involved in essential war work? Because you will often find that in the register. That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing. And Kelly has said, I found that too in the 1841 census. Wife's family were 2 doors away. I had the census page for years before I looked into her tree. I think that reminds me of what I was talking about last week, actually. If you're trying to find maiden names, that when you're searching census records, do have a glance around at the surrounding areas, because relatives may well be in very nearby properties or perhaps even lodging. Lynn Marie Alex has said, question of the week, birth locations of great aunts and uncles allowed me to follow and confirm the Texas front. Oh, wow, that's cool. Confirm the Texas frontier military locations of my second great grandfather and his family. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing. Karen saying, I always look at the neighbours on English censuses. And one more. I think this is from Miko. Oh no, Miko's responding to somebody else. So there's no point. Ursula Anna said, question of the week. My grandfather was born in the East End of London, was one of 19 children. Whoa. That must have been a lively household. 10 of which had died. Still, 9 living children is yeah, wow. That's a big old family, that almost sounds like a record. Janet's recommending a book called The Baby Killers, about the Zeppelin raids, etc. Well, I'm going to add that to my reading list. Thank you very much. Miko said, World War I originally had much more mobile warfare and consideration of air attacks. They only moved to trench warfare as a last-ditch effort when everything else was done and dusted. You know, a wonderful way with words, Miko. Thank you for that. Keep those comments coming in. Ellie's watching them. I'm going to be revisiting them, but we're already half an hour through and I haven't even got to census yet. Right, I best get moving. So, census records. I think I even got a ban for this. The wonderful world of census records. So, census records. What are they, and why are they so important? Well, I think you probably know what census records are. You know what I'm like, I can't resist doing a little bit of ancient history with this. Censuses go back a long way. Tax assessments, or early censuses, later known by the Roman Empire as the Indication, were actually made in Britain in Roman times. They were detailed records, sadly haven't survived. Imagine that, if you could check out your Celtic or Roman ancestors in the, I don't know, the 32 AD census or something. But yeah, so they go back a very long way. Of course, William the Conqueror took things a step further with his famous Domesday Book in 1086. Again, that was for tax purposes. And the origins of British census records probably do have some roots in taxation as well. The first national census, there were smaller regional censuses. You know, we've got some early Catholic censuses on our Catholic Heritage Archive, but the first national decennial census, you know, that is a census that's taken every 10 years in the UK, was started in 1801, and this was championed by a statistician by the name of John Rickman, and the plan was not so much taxation. It was initially conducted really to partly ascertain the number of able-bodied fighting men who could be thrown against the military might of France in the Napoleonic Wars. And they were also kind of kicked off as well over population concerns. There'd been an essay in 1798 on the principle of population by a chap called Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus. And that had led to a few different concerns about declining population and knowledge being needed. So, but when Rickman laid out his idea for a decennial census, not sentence, I'm getting the word all, they're not easy words. That's my excuse. He set out 12 reasons in this 1798 petition. Gave them to Parliament. They came up in debates, and the kind of road to conducting a census of Great Britain had begun. But the following justifications that were set out at the start were to get the intimate knowledge of any country must form the rational basis of legislation and diplomacy. An industrious population is the basic power and resource of any nation, and therefore its size needs to be known. The number of men who are required for conscription to the militia in different areas should reflect the area's population. There were defence reasons for wanting to know the number of seamen. Of course, naval power was key at the time. They wanted to know how many men could be press-ganged or at least recruited into the Royal Navy. Also, the need to plan the production of corn. Corn was very important back then, and thus know the number of people who had to be fed. Also, a census would indicate the government's intention to promote the public good. And the life insurance industry, this is a strange one for the 1790s, the life insurance industry would be stimulated by the results. So those were the reasons they put out. But as I've said, so the first national census started in 1801. Probably jumped the gun a bit here. If you're I imagine you're not sitting there thinking, what is a census? But if you are, a census is basically a head count of everyone in the country on a given day. And yeah, these have been taken every 10 years in England and Wales and separately for Scotland since 1801, with the exception of 1941 because there was a war on. That's why the 1939 register, census, it's not really a census that isn't a census, is so essential if you're looking at your ancestors during this period. We've been through the reasons. It was to obtain detailed information about individuals, but also give information about who the population were as a whole. But it listed everybody by name, wherever they happened to be on census night, because that was basically the most efficient way of counting everybody, and it ensured nobody got counted twice. Well, of course, there are exceptions, like one of the comments that was submitted before. So how was it taken, and on what dates? So in every census year, an enumerator delivered a form to each household in the country for them to complete. The heads of the household were the ones instructed to give details of everybody who slept in the dwelling on that night. So not just people who resided there, anyone who slept there on census night, which tended to be a Sunday, I believe. And then the forms that would be completed by each household, known as schedules, would be collected a few days later by the enumerator. And from 1841 to 1901, information from the schedules, this was then copied into enumeration books. And once these books had been completed, most of the household schedules were destroyed, although there were some rare survivals. But it's the enumeration books that you consult today when you're searching censuses from 1841 to 1901. That's why 1911 is a little bit special, because it's currently the only available online UK census that actually includes the forms filled in by the householders themselves. So you will see your ancestors' handwriting, you may see suffragette protests, we briefly discussed last week. You may see silly entries like people listing their pets and things like that. More on that later, provided we have enough time. So yeah, that's basically how they were taken. The 1841 census, which is the earliest surviving complete census, was the first to list the name of every single individual, not just the head of the household, which makes it not only due to the fact that it's the only one that's really available in full online, but the earliest really genuinely useful census for family historians. But censuses did get more detailed over time. Less information was collected in 1841 and in later years. And I'll probably run through that in a little bit, just to tell you what you'll find in each different census. So originally it was the General Register Office that was responsible for taking the census. I'm sure you'll all know who they are. They're the lovely folks who were responsible for civil registration, the people that you send off to when you want a copy of your ancestor's birth, marriage, or death certificate. And they'd have a superintendent registrar who'd be responsible for collecting the returns of each of the births and deaths in their registration district and sending them to the census office in London. So yeah, we probably don't need to go too much into the detail, but the census dates for each one, if you're wondering when they were on. So the 1841 census was taken on the 6th of June. The 1851 census was taken on the 30th of March. The 1861 in 7th of April, 71 2nd of April, 81 3rd of April, 91 5th of April, 1901 31st of March, and 1911 2nd of April. And 2021, which is currently underway now, will be the census day is on, as I think I've already said, 21st of March. The earlier censuses from 1801 to 1831, so it includes 1811, 1821 as well, These were lists of names that were not collected centrally. Some are held in local record offices. Fragments survive. Other lists were sometimes compiled for all sorts of reasons, and these are often known as census substitutes, which can be very useful if you're searching for ancestors during these periods. But yeah, sadly, from 1801 to 1831, there aren't any complete censuses available anywhere online. But if you're looking between 1841 and 1911, of course, these records are widely available, including on Findmypast. How should you go about how should you go about searching them, though? Censuses can provide you with a wealth of information. One of the things I really like about them is that if your ancestors have distinctive names, as long as they're not called John Smith or something like that, it's quite easy to follow the census back decade by decade, because of course you're getting a snapshot of whole families. Normally children, parents, spouses are listed alongside the person that you're looking for, and this is all really along with birthplaces, birth years of birth, things that are really useful for jumping back. So they're very useful for a variety of reasons. They can be used to corroborate facts you might find in birth, marriage, death certificates, or you can use the facts you find in birth, marriage, and death certificates to corroborate the information you find in the censuses. So yeah, essential resource. Tips though, watch out for transcription errors. You know, of course, the censuses, the original images are packed with old handwriting. Humans are fallible, mistakes are sometimes made. Forms can be hard to read. This can result in misspellings. If you can't find an ancestor, if you're really struggling to find someone, try using a wildcard search or searching various variations in spelling of their name. If you can't find an ancestor at home with their family, think where else they may be. Could they have been serving overseas in the armed forces? Could they have been a little bit naughty and have ended up in prison? Might be worth checking our crime, prisons and punishment collection. Could they have fallen on the hard times and ended up in the workhouse? Could they have been at a boarding school, in a hospital, or away at sea? There are various reasons. So just bear that in mind if you're struggling to find someone. And of course, that goes back to the fact that censuses record everybody who is sleeping at a given address on census night, not necessarily the people that were living there full time. Your ancestor may have been boarding. They may have been away with work. They could have been a traveling salesman. They could have been staying with relatives. All things that are worth bearing in mind. Some people were missed off. Not massively common, I'd say, but unfortunately, sometimes folks are just missing, and that may be a brick wall that you find it very difficult to get past. That's why things like census substitutes can be so invaluable. But as we've also said, sometimes they may have been recorded twice, so that's also worth bearing in mind as well. So quick rundown of what each census will reveal. So 1841, which is the least detailed census, that'll give you first name and surname, age, rounded down to the nearest 5 years for those aged 15 or over. It'll give you their gender, their occupation, whether they were born in the county where they were enumerated, that'll be yes or no, whether they were born in Scotland, Ireland, or foreign parts. 1851 to 1861 are much more detailed. They list the names of everybody. You'll get first name, sometimes middle names, often just as initials, surnames as well. You'll get relationship to the head of the household, marital status, age at their last birthday, their rank, profession or occupation, where born. This is very useful. County and parish if born in England and Wales, country only if they were born outside of England and Wales. And this is when infirmities started to get listed as well. So whether they were blind, deaf, or dumb. Those are the ones that you'll most commonly see. 1871 to 1881 get even more detailed. So they have a last column that now reads blind, deaf, dumb, imbecile, idiot, or lunatic. One thing to add, that is the language of the time. You know, obviously, sometimes we can see wording in old records that seems a little bit iffy to our modern eyes, but you know, this is an unfiltered snapshot of history. That's something you've got to remember when you're looking at these. 1891, again, another layer of detail, whether an employer employed or neither employer or employed. And in Wales, it'll tell you the language spoken, which is, if you want to know whether your ancestors were Welsh speakers, that's very useful. 1901 had a few details changed as well. Employer, worker, or owner account was the new criteria. A new column was added to say if they were working at home. And language spoken was also added to the Isle of Man. I think that must have been if they were speaking the Manx language. But 1911 is easily the most detailed, not only because we have the original householder forms, but because more questions were asked. For married women only, the number of years of their present marriage, the number of children born to that marriage, the number of children still living, and the number of that died was added. I think someone touched on that in the comments earlier before. As well as their occupation, the 1911 census also asked which industry, the industry in which the person was employed. I don't believe this is available on the returns you get in 1911 though, but it was asked. For anyone born outside of England and Wales, the census also asked whether they're a resident, a visitor, or a visitor in the country. And nationalisation of anyone born overseas, whether British by parentage, British by naturalisation, or if a foreign national of a country, that would be added as well. And in the infirmity column, another little extra slice of detail: the age at which the person has become afflicted with that ailment had also been added in. Another thing, you can't talk about censuses without talking about house history. Censuses are vital for house history. We know, based on the blogs we've published and the broadcasts we've done before, that house history is something many of you are very enthusiastic about. Censuses are amazing for that. Exact addresses were not required in 1841, only place. But from 1851, exact addresses were required, including the house name or the number, if there was one. You know, in rural areas, the only information given still might be the name of the village or the parish, because they might not necessarily have had a number or a name of their abode. And one thing to remember when you're doing this is that street numberings change over time, as do house names. Just because your house is, I don't know, 22 Bellon Villas today doesn't mean it was 22 Bellon Villas in 1841. No, not in 1841, because you wouldn't get it, in 1861. So do a little bit of research around the block, around outside do a little bit of additional research. You could look at maps, you could look at other local resources, look at returns for neighbouring properties, take a look at the whole street, see if that can help you as well. In 1911 as well, the number of rooms was shown on all household schedules. So yeah, that's interesting as well. But I think I'm probably going into a little bit too much detail here. Hopefully that will have given you an overview of why censuses are important and why you need to search them. Of course, it's not just England and Wales. We also have census records for Ireland, even though relatively few survive. The ones that do, given how tricky Irish research can often be pretty essential to uncovering your past, actually. The only fully surviving census returns for Ireland are from 1901 and 1911. Only fragments remain of the 19th century, sadly. But these fragments are still pretty significant. They document more than, I think, something like 600,000 people in 1821, 1831, 1841, 1851. If your ancestors were in County Cavan, Fermanagh, Galway, Offaly, Meath, Derry, Londonderry, Cavan, Antrim, they're all pretty well represented in the surviving records. So there's hope. Just have a look and see what is available online. I think I'll leave it there for census searching. I'm probably teaching my grandmother to suck eggs in some respects. I know many of you will probably be using these for years. Let's have a quick look at some comments. Oh, there's so many. William Shaw said, my great-grandfather happened to be loaned to the Turkish government until the 30th of April of 1914. Wow, 3 months later, it was totally a different world he was travelling around in. Was he given back? Thanks for sharing that, William. Oh, Audrey, comment from Audrey, which has to be read out. Someone mentioned an ancestor appearing twice in the census. It's unusual, but not as rare as you may think. It's usually where people didn't follow the instructions and listed people who lived at the address but were absent on census night. I didn't know that. Thank you, Audrey. The person would also be correctly recorded at the addresses where they spent census night. Also, some households got forms from two enumerators because each of them thought it was in their patch. If both were filled in and returned, the family would appear in both. So thank you, Audrey. That's a wonderful insight. Thank you very much for sharing. Let's have another look. Well, Emma Jolly's watching. Hello, Emma. I hope you're well. I can see you answering people's questions. That's great to see. Linda Robertson's also got a family recorded twice in the 1881 census in different places in London. Probably a prime example of what Audrey was just talking about. Joy Stocks has been using some of these early census fragments. She's been using the local Shropshire census for 1821 and 31. Very useful to confirm places for families. And Anya saying the fun of transcription errors. Transcription errors can be fun as well. We do like a challenge, don't we? I always make sure I flag them if I eventually find out who it was I was looking for. Let's have a look at one more. Linda Roberts says she's actually very glad her great-grandparents didn't understand the instructions on the 1911 census, as they wrote down 2 children had died, all scored out by the enumerator, but still legible just. Well, you do find some. That's what I love about 1911. You find some brilliant things. I mean, some of my favourite ones is the pets. So, for example, Roger, the Airedale Terrier. Roger was a member of the Little family in Dulwich, and the head of the house, James Little, included quite a few charming details about his 4-legged friend. He said, "Incidentally, we have an Airedale Terrier." He wrote down, "I do not know whether particulars are required, but in case you want them, here they are." Love that. He went on to describe Roger as being 5 years old, having been born in Yorkshire. His occupation was listed as watchdog, so he was unemployed. He was employed on his own account, actually. That's what the census specified that. And his industry was listed as looking after the house. He appears to have been of quite good breeding, actually, because in the section on the census form dedicated to listing how many children have, James wrote, "Not sure, but something over 100." And of course, it wasn't only dogs. You find cats as well. I've shared this one before, but I love it. Dogs. Birkenhead, which is actually where I went to school, the Rigby family listed their cat Tom in the census. He was listed as being one of the children in the household. He was listed as being 8 years old, married. His occupation was mouse catcher, soloist, and thief, and he had 16 children. Birthplace was listed as Cheshire, so he was a Cheshire cat. And his infirmity was described as speechless. So the Rigbys certainly had a sense of humour. The enumerator did not, because he scribbled it out and wrote in big angry letters, "This is a cat." But in the last 10 minutes we've got, I said I wanted to take a quick look at the history of census taking in the UK, but more specifically public reactions. How did people react? What did they think? Our newspapers are one of the best things, I think, out there online if you want to get a sense of what our ancestors thought, felt, how they expressed their opinions, what was dominating the conversation at the time. And yeah, they chart the evolution of public attitudes to census taking from 1801 up to the present day, pretty much. And you see things from initial fears and suspicions to feelings of pride and honour. It changed. So let's have a quick look. We're conscious we've only got 10 minutes, and many of you will be jumping off at 5 to join Fiona. But yeah, so let's have a look at when the first census was taken, 1801 and 1811. So as I've said already, it was fueled by fears over Britain's population, and the amount of food produced would be sufficient to support this growth. The Census Act was passed in 1800, and then in 1801, on the 10th of March, or as soon as they could do after that date, the first census since the Domesday Book, the first national census since the Domesday Book was taken. It recorded the population of England and Wales as being 8.9 million. Wales' population was just over 541,000, and Scotland's was 1.6 million, which shows how insanely fast the population has risen since then. But early on, it didn't really register that much in newspapers. The reports on the 1801 and 1811 censuses were pretty scant. Didn't take up that much page space. The Ipswich Journal did have a real quick report, which said Gainsborough by the late census contains males 2,094, females 2,411, total 4,505. So yeah, they'd report on statistics and things like that, but not much else, to be honest. When the next census was introduced in 1811, this is when penalties started to become involved. Penalties of £5 were imposed for any householders equivocating or giving a false return. And you can find out, there's loads of that, like the Hampshire Chronicle, for example, wrote about it. And this, but again, most of the reports are around population growth. So by 1811, population had increased by 1.6 million since the last census. The Globe, which was quite a well-known newspaper back then, was reporting how the population is considerably increased in all parts of the kingdom, and that the kingdom too was suffering from a melancholy surplus of old maids. It's awful, that, isn't it? In places like Norwich, females exceeded the males by nearly 6,000. And there were a few conjectures as to why that may be. So the National Register of London, they conjectured that it was the effects of war and emigration may be ascertained in comparing the number of males to females, while some other changes were afoot. The same newspaper in October that year also reported how the Census Act was going important modifications. It said the population of Ireland is, as it ought to be comprehended in the enumeration, as also His Majesty's subjects serving in the Navy, the Army, the Merchant Service, and on board small craft of every description without regulation of this kind. Oh, sorry, I've got my sentences mixed up. So it's going to be covering merchant service, small craft of every description. So without a regulation of this kind, the returns must be deficient, which is fair. The object of legislation frustrated and the physical strength of the empire remained unascertained. But I love seeing this because it really shows you that people were aware of why the census was being taken. It was being taken to help feed the nation, but also determine strength. This was a time when we were at war with France, and that needed to be known. But by 1821 and 1831, that's when you start to see reports of people not being too happy about being recorded in the census. So the 1821 census taken in May that year, the Sun of London reported that from all the information we can obtain, there would appear to be a very considerable increase of inhabitants as compared with the census of 1811. Not surprising, the population continued to go up. And they also, they went on to say the year 1811 was a time of war when, beside other causes of inaccuracy, many people either misunderstood the measure or from groundless alarms of taxation and military service. I don't think the concerns of military service were groundless alarms. Basically, were not reconciled to being numbered. So resistance was already starting to take root. So these two obstacles, kind of ignorance and suspicion, pop up time and time again, basically throughout the 19th century. They continued. But there were also reports showing the dutifulness of other examples. So, for example, the people of Gateshead in 1831 have manifested in every instance the utmost readiness to afford the information required. But people were still pretty nervous. So the Dublin Morning Register in 1841 reported on the efforts of foot-weary enumerators and the difficulties they faced in collecting census returns. In many cases, they found it difficult to obtain any returns at all. I mean, given that they were doing this in Ireland on behalf of the British government, probably not that hard to understand why. But yeah, in many cases, they found it difficult to get any returns back at all. And there were many instances, many were lost, mislaid, forgotten, or apparently not that well understood by the people filling them in. But this is a newspaper writing about the Irish population at the time, so take that with a pinch of salt. But 1841 was when the next significant change came about. And that was a significant change to the census itself. Census of 1841, as we know, first modern census. And this was the first time that households would be recorded in serious detail before, with their occupation, age, the gender listed, whether or not they were born in the country or whether they were born outside. And in Ireland, this led to very great offence. So the Dublin Monitor said, very great offence has been given throughout the country by the minuteness of the inquiry as printed in the printed forms of the new census. Every family in the kingdom, we doubt not, considers the argus eye of the government fixed upon their most private concerns, and that all the information thus collected will be made public and thus become food for the scandal and gossip mongers. Many families have been thrown into the greatest consternation, not so much on account of filling up the particulars respecting sex, occupation, and number of sons and daughters of servants employed, and other innumerable etceteras, but principally by the extreme rigidness as to age, which must be noted down to the very year. Very, very indignant about that. So it seems, just as it is today, in some instances, asking someone's age was a little bit taboo. But you find poems, you find sketches, you find examples of stage performances detailing census taken throughout the newspapers. You see it becoming more of a kind of cultural talking point, really. 18, so moving on, 1851, perhaps. The Derby Mercury reports how the census has perhaps been less talked about in general society than on former occasions, a natural result of a growing familiarity with the Great Decennial Act. Probably true. People had now been filling these in, but everyone had filled it in 1841. They were used to it. They knew what was coming. There was less suspicion. Attitudes were generally seeming to change. The Manchester Times expanded on this, and it said that many looked forward to, with a thrill of expectation, to the coming census, and how a man will realise the dignity of his patriarchal preeminence in filling up the list of his family, self, wife, children, boys, girls, men, servants, women, servants, and the stranger that is within his gates for whom he feels immediately responsible. So you can see attitudes are moving from suspicion and fear to pride. Filling in the census is an honour. It's an opportunity for you to show off and stand up and make yourself counted. But the suspicions didn't go away. In 1861, you had reports in papers like the Carlisle Journal saying some people dislike so much to be questioned at all, and others are so apt to blunder when anything is to be put down in ruled columns. It is very necessary to take all precautions for ensuring as correct and complete a set of answers as possible. Sorry. And some of the newspapers started to kind of rally behind the cause. So the Swindon Advertiser and North Wilts Chronicle carried an injunction, "Know thyself," which contained a memorandum of some of the objects and uses of the census, encouraging people to take part. Basically said the area of these islands is limited, and it is a matter of no small interest to know how many mouths there are to feed, and at what rates they are increasing, and how they are likely to increase by subsisting marriages. How many are dependent on several kinds of industry, deriving materials from the produce of the soil or from the wider fields of foreign commerce. The census supplies answers to all these questions and shows how population is increased or diminished by marriages at different ages, by the different species of industry, by the emigration to our vast colonial possessions. Very, very interesting. I mean, I'd love to carry on. I think 1871, you did start to get almost the church kind of getting behind it as well. In 1871, it was starting to be described as a great national work. You had archbishops coming out and supporting it. So the Preston Herald in 1871 went on how Archbishop Manning has taken very great interest in the census. He understands all about it and what it is for. So he wrote a circular which he had printed with instructions to all his clergy to read it out before Mass on Palm Sunday. The effect of this was that when I went around this morning, there was not a court or alley with Roman Catholics in it that was not ready. By 1881, 1891 and 1911, the public were much more familiar about it. 1881, you still have reports of sermons being given instructing people to fill in the census. But the concerns were still there. In 1891, you also had reports saying there was still a great deal of impertinence. One newspaper used a cartoon by a guy called Paul Pry as basically saying, on census day, an Englishman's home is no longer his castle. It was on Sunday last that the Registrar General, Sir Bridges Henniker, assumed the garb of Paul Pry, and had at the head of an army of ubiquitous busybodies thrust his nose into every domicile without as much as an apologetic hope. I hope I don't intrude. So I think I'll wrap that up there. But yeah, that gives you an idea of changing attitudes to the censuses over time. I guess attitudes still vary, but I think one of the important things about censuses and filling them in is leaving your mark. It allows you to be recorded. Who knows if by filling in this 2021 census now, which may well be the last census taken because they're looking at new and more efficient ways of recording this information, not only you're ensuring that the correct provisions are available for supporting your communities and things like that, but you're also perhaps helping your descendants in the future find out who you were, what you were doing, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, censuses are great, aren't they wonderful? We couldn't do family history without them. Fill them in and stand up and be counted. So I'll have a quick look at a few comments because we're already past 5 before we jump off. So Anya saying, I don't know if adding Luna the cat along with my religion of Jedi will be appreciated on our census return next year. Who knows? Audrey saying, everyone should be included, but recent immigrants might be very suspicious of authority or just not know what was expected of them, especially if their English wasn't totally so good. That's a comment on why you might not find people in there. Let's have another look, see if we've got any more questions of the week. Kelly McDonald, I find Irish censuses more difficult. They hardly ever give the right age and often, for mine, only put the country of birth. Yeah, Irish censuses can be tricky, but they're very important. You need them. Cindy Pennington said other censuses too, especially those in institutions. Yes, like hospitals, prisons, or workhouses. I only got one due to occupation and further non-census prison records. Yeah, that censuses do record institutions. You'll find your workhouse ancestors in the census, just not at a domestic dwelling. Matthew Donovan said, one of my interesting finds on the census has been in 1939 register, which is almost a census, but not quite. I've recently found my great-grandparents, but the odd thing is that their year of birth differs from other sources. Well, the 1939 register was pretty accurate on that. So depending on what the other sources are, I'd say that I'd kind of put your faith behind the 1939 register. Another look. We'll do one more. We'll end with a comment from Beth. So Beth said, question of the week, I had at least one family member who was baptized, born using one name, but went by another name on other documents. I managed to trace a woman who was baptized Sydney on the census with her mother and stepfather as Sydney Emily. After she married, she became Emily. So yeah, another great reminder of try searching for different name variations, different spellings, all those kind of things. Don't forget, get in touch. Let us know about your amazing discoveries in the censuses. If you find anything truly remarkable, if you've got a story that you feel deserves to be told, shared with the world, get in touch. We'd be glad to share it. And I think all that remains is to say goodbye. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in. Sorry I didn't spend more time reading through your comments. There were so many of them, which is always lovely to see. Apologies for my waffling. I hope you found at least some of it interesting, useful, or entertaining at least. And I will be back, hopefully, in the not too distant future. Have wonderful weekends. Continue researching. Best of luck in all your ancestor hunting. Thank you again for tuning in. And I will see you again. Goodbye. Stay safe in touch.